Little girl screams at hospital in pain. Doctor's shocking discovery leads to a 911 call in tears. Crying. Before we dive into this story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. A sense of urgency gripped the hospital as the day unfolded in its usual rhythm. The routine was abruptly interrupted when an 8-year-old girl was rushed into the emergency room, her body racked with pain. The child clutched her stomach, her face pale with distress, eyes wide with fear, and tears staining her flushed cheeks. The hospital staff immediately sprang into action, but this was no ordinary case. The pain the child was experiencing wasn't just physical, it was deep, something more profound than a simple stomach ache. The attending doctor, Dr. Sofia Martinez, felt an unsettling shift in the air the moment she heard the nurse's report. An emergency had been called in for a child, and the details suggested something much more complex than an upset stomach. The usual cases were manageable, routine, even, but something about this girl's presentation signaled that this one would be different. Dr. Martinez had been a pediatrician for over a decade, and in her time, she had treated countless children from minor injuries to life-threatening conditions. She had seen it all, or so she thought. As she readied herself for the emergency, her mind was sharp, prepared for whatever lay ahead. Yet as the minutes ticked by, something lingered at the edge of her thoughts. The situation felt off. She had learned over the years to trust her instincts, and in this moment, every instinct told her that there was more to this little girl's pain than met the eye. The fear in the child's eyes wasn't just fear of the unknown, it was a fear of something she had experienced before, something that had hurt her deeply. The child was ushered into the examination room, her small hand trembling as she reached out for the bed, her other hand still clutching the stuffed rabbit that had clearly been her source of comfort through whatever ordeal had brought her here. The nurse, her face pale, updated Dr. Martinez with the few details available. An 8-year-old girl named Lily experiencing severe stomach pain with no clear medical explanation as yet. She had been brought in by an older man who claimed to be her uncle. The man's story, though, sounded unconvincing. There was a nervous tremor in his voice, an unease that didn't align with the calm demeanor one would expect from someone handling a medical emergency involving a child. As Dr. Martinez entered the room, the girl looked up at her, her big eyes reflecting an overwhelming sadness and confusion. She sat on the examination table, her legs dangling, and every movement seemed to cause her discomfort. It was clear that this wasn't a simple case of a stomach virus or food poisoning. This child had been through something far worse. But what? Dr. Martinez's gaze shifted to the man standing near the door, the so-called uncle, whose presence only added to the feeling of discomfort. He wasn't a source of support or calm for Lily. Rather, he seemed to be a figure of authority, the kind of figure who, despite his apparent concern, was somehow fueling the fear in the child's eyes. It was as if Lily didn't trust him, but she was bound to him, unable to escape the situation he had placed her in. Dr. Martinez couldn't ignore the knot forming in her stomach as she observed the child's reaction. Lily flinched as Dr. Martinez gently approached, her little body stiffening as the doctor reached out to take her vitals. Dr. Martinez spoke softly, trying to ease the tension. "Hi there, sweetheart. I'm Dr. Martinez. Can you tell me where it hurts?" The girl's gaze shifted back and forth between the doctor and the man, her lips quivering slightly as she whispered, "It hurts here," pressing her small hand against her stomach. But her eyes didn't meet Dr. Martinez's. They kept darting nervously to the man at the door. Dr. Martinez knew something wasn't right. This was more than just physical pain. This was fear, raw and unspoken. And it was fear directed at the man who claimed to be her protector. What had happened to Lily? What was she hiding? The tension in the room was palpable, suffocating, almost. Dr. Martinez knew that this was no ordinary medical emergency, and she needed to get to the heart of what was going on fast. She tried again, her voice gentle but firm. "Lily, can you tell me when it started? How long have you been feeling this pain?" The girl didn't answer right away, her gaze flicking nervously toward the man once again. The man shifted his weight uncomfortably, but he didn't say anything, only looked at the child with a strange expression. A wave of concern washed over Dr. Martinez. She knew she had to act quickly. There was something deeply unsettling about this whole situation. The girl was terrified, and the man's presence seemed to make it worse. But why? What was he hiding? The doctor's medical training kicked in, and she moved swiftly, trying to balance the need for a thorough examination with the urgency of the situation. She began to ask more questions, gently prodding the girl to open up, but Lily remained tight-lipped, as though protecting a secret too heavy for someone so young to bear. In those first moments, as Dr. Martinez continued her assessment, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a medical emergency, it was a cry for help. Something was terribly wrong. The child's pain wasn't just physical. It was emotional, psychological, and possibly even the result of something far more sinister. Dr. Martinez's mind raced. Who was this man, really? And why was Lily so afraid? What had she gone through that caused her to trust no one, not even the medical professionals trying to help her? The buzzing fluorescent lights in the hospital room seemed to grow louder in the silence that followed, punctuating the growing tension. The unease in the room was unmistakable. There was something darker at play here, something that went beyond medical treatment. This was about uncovering a truth that, if left untold, could cost Lily more than just her health. It could cost her freedom, her safety, her future. And Dr. Martinez was determined to find out what it was, no matter what it took. The next few minutes felt like an eternity as Dr. Martinez carefully examined Lily, her mind focused, but her heart heavy with the unspoken question that lingered in the air. What had happened to this little girl? And, more importantly, why was no one telling the truth? Dr. Martinez's resolve hardened. Whatever it took, she would uncover the truth. This child's pain would not be ignored. The stakes were higher than she had anticipated. It wasn't just about fixing a stomach ache anymore. It was about saving Lily and perhaps others like her from a danger that had yet to be revealed. The child's condition was immediately alarming. She was visibly in distress, her small frame trembling as she clutched her stomach tightly, as though she could somehow hold the pain in place. Her eyes were wide with fear, darting between the doctor and the man she referred to as her uncle. Despite the obvious discomfort, her body language suggested that there was more to her situation than simple physical pain. This was not a normal response to an ailment. The child's fear was palpable, a fear that seemed far too deep for a mere stomach ache. The doctor, though trained to handle a wide array of medical emergencies, couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Dr. Martinez approached the girl slowly, offering her a comforting smile, hoping to ease her tension. She knelt down to meet the child at eye level, speaking in a calm, soothing voice. She attempted to engage the girl in a conversation, hoping to gain a clearer understanding of her condition. "Sweetheart, can you tell me what's hurting? How long have you been feeling like this?" The words were meant to comfort, to encourage trust, but the girl didn't respond immediately. Instead, she only tightened her grip on her stomach and shifted her gaze nervously toward the man standing nearby. It was as if the presence of the man was a shield, something she felt the need to protect herself with, yet also something she didn't trust. The girl's reluctance to speak was concerning. Typically, children in pain would at least be able to vocalize their discomfort, even if they were scared. But this little girl was not just silent. She seemed to be closing herself off entirely. Dr. Martinez recognized the pattern, a child who was hesitant to speak, avoiding eye contact, and showing signs of fear, even when help was being offered. These weren't just the behaviors of a frightened patient. They were the behaviors of a child who had learned to protect herself in a world that had not been kind. It was as if she knew better than to trust anyone, even those who were there to help her. The girl's eyes never stayed fixed on the doctor for long, and whenever Dr. Martinez moved too close, she recoiled slightly, as though the very presence of an adult who cared was something unfamiliar to her. This wasn't the typical response of a child in a hospital, even one in pain. Dr. Martinez, though deeply concerned, maintained her professional composure, but her mind began to race. What was it that had caused this child to retreat into herself like this? Why was she so guarded, so fearful? The discomfort the girl displayed was not just in her body, but also in her soul. Dr. Martinez's experience had taught her to look beyond the physical symptoms, to notice the signs of emotional distress, the unspoken signals that often told a much deeper story. And the more she observed the girl, the more she felt that there was something hidden behind her pain, something that went beyond a simple medical issue. It was almost as if the girl was protecting herself from a threat that wasn't immediately visible, a threat that might not be physical at all. As Dr. Martinez continued her examination, she began to notice more subtle signs that raised her suspicion. The girl's hands, though small and delicate, were marked with faint bruises, almost as if she had been gripping something too hard or had been in a situation where she had needed to hold on for dear life. Her clothes, while clean, seemed a little too worn for a child of her age, as though they had been through more than one set of hands. But it wasn't just the physical signs that made Dr. Martinez uneasy, it was the girl's mannerisms. Every time the doctor moved, the girl flinched. Her breathing, though rapid, was shallow, as if she were afraid to take a full breath. These were not the signs of a child with a simple stomach ache. They were the signs of a child who had been through something far more traumatic. The girl's gaze, when it finally met the doctor's, was filled with a mixture of fear and confusion. It was as if she wanted to trust, wanted to believe that someone could help her. But something inside her stopped her from fully embracing that hope. Her eyes flickered toward the man standing by the door, her uncle, as he had introduced himself. It was in that glance that Dr. Martinez first saw it. The girl wasn't just afraid of the pain in her body, she was terrified of the man she was with. There was an unmistakable discomfort, a subtle but telling fear that the girl couldn't hide, despite her best efforts to appear calm. She looked to him for reassurance, but there was no comfort in his presence, only uncertainty. Dr. Martinez's experience told her that children in distress often sought the comfort of the adults around them, particularly when they were in a vulnerable state. But Lily's behavior was the opposite. She kept looking to the man not for comfort, but for permission. Permission to speak, permission to act, permission to trust. It was a subtle but unmistakable signal that there was something fundamentally wrong with the situation. As the doctor continued her examination, she grew more and more convinced that the girl's physical pain was not the only thing she was struggling with. The reluctance to speak, the fear, the emotional withdrawal, all of these were clues pointing to something much darker. Dr. Martinez had encountered cases of abuse before, but there was something different about this one. The child wasn't just hiding her pain. She was hiding something far more dangerous, something that, if left unaddressed, could threaten her very safety. Despite all the signs, Dr. Martinez knew she needed more than her instincts to move forward. She couldn't make assumptions without evidence, and she had to be careful not to alarm the child further. She gently asked Lily more questions, trying to gain some insight into her situation without pressing too hard. The girl's answers were vague at best, and each time she spoke, she glanced nervously at the man standing by the door. It was as though she had been trained to keep things vague, to say just enough to avoid further scrutiny without giving away too much. It was a behavior that made Dr. Martinez's heart sink. The doctor, though concerned, tried to maintain a professional demeanor. But inside, her mind was racing. This was no ordinary case. She had to find out what was happening to this little girl. The stakes were too high for her to turn a blind eye. There was something terribly wrong, and Dr. Martinez knew she had to act quickly, not just as a medical professional, but as an advocate for a child who couldn't speak for herself. As the examination continued, it became clear that this was a situation that went beyond physical ailment. The girl's body was speaking louder than her words ever could, and every gesture, every glance, was telling Dr. Martinez a story of fear, confusion, and pain. It was a story that would take all of her skill, patience, and intuition to uncover, a story that was far more complicated than anyone had anticipated. But Dr. Martinez knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning of something much larger than she could have ever imagined. As Dr. Martinez continued her examination of Lily, the unsettling feeling in her gut only grew stronger. The initial diagnosis, which had seemed to point to a common stomach issue, no longer seemed to fit the situation. Lily's pain, while real and intense, didn't correlate with any typical medical condition. The girl's body language, combined with the subtle signs of distress that Dr. Martinez had observed, suggested that the issue went beyond simple illness. It became increasingly clear that there was something deeper and more sinister at play. Lily's responses were vague, and the more Dr. Martinez tried to probe, the more the girl seemed to withdraw. The physical symptoms didn't line up with any obvious medical diagnosis, but the emotional and psychological toll on the child was evident. The girl's hesitations when asked about her pain, the way she nervously glanced toward the man in the room, all suggested that the true cause of her distress was being hidden from the doctor, from the authorities, and perhaps even from herself. There was a weight to her silence, an unspoken truth that hung in the air, one that neither Lily nor the man could or would share. The first crucial discovery came when Dr. Martinez took a closer look at Lily's medical history. The nurse had briefed her earlier that Lily had been in and out of various foster homes, though the details were scant. The little girl had been moved from one place to another, each transition coming with its own set of challenges. As the doctor examined her chart, she noticed an odd pattern. Lily's previous medical visits, though frequent, lacked sufficient documentation. Her medical records appeared incomplete, and there were gaps in her care history that didn't seem to add up. These gaps, while not uncommon in cases of children in foster care, were still unsettling. A child who had been in and out of homes should have had a clear, well-documented medical history, but Lily's records told a different story. The more Dr. Martinez delved into Lily's past, the more concerning details emerged. There was no record of a stable guardian for the child, no mention of any long-term care arrangements. The man who claimed to be her uncle, Mike Patterson, according to the paperwork, had no legal guardianship documentation, and no official record existed of any temporary custody arrangement being filed with the authorities. This was a red flag. In cases like this, there were always legal procedures to follow. But Mike's story didn't seem to align with the legal framework that should have been in place. Dr. Martinez's suspicions grew as she reviewed the medical records further. A child in Lily's situation, one who had been shuffled through multiple homes, should have had a social worker involved at every step. But there was no record of one. No one seemed to be tracking the child's well-being consistently. Lily had been sent for several medical evaluations in the past, but there was no follow-up on any of them, no consistent care provider. This absence of proper oversight was alarming. It wasn't just a case of neglect. It appeared to be something much more deliberate, a systematic evasion of accountability. Dr. Martinez was now convinced that Lily's physical symptoms were not the result of a simple stomach issue, but were a manifestation of something far darker. Her investigation began to take a more focused turn. Dr. Martinez knew that what she was dealing with was not a typical case. The child's pain had to be linked to something other than just a physical ailment. As she examined Lily's body more closely, she found evidence of what looked like old bruises on her arms and legs. These marks, though faded, were not the kind typically seen in children who had simply been roughhousing or playing. They were the kind of marks that came from fear, from someone who had been in a position where they needed to defend themselves. The girl's body told a story of silent suffering, one that was too real to ignore. The deeper Dr. Martinez looked, the more she began to understand that Lily's pain was not just about her stomach. It was about her life, her experiences, and the trauma she had been forced to endure. Dr. Martinez's next step was to subtly shift her focus. She knew she needed to gain Lily's trust, but that would take time. So, she began to talk to her gently, trying to create an environment where the child felt safe enough to speak. Lily, Dr. Martinez began, her voice soft and non-threatening. Sometimes when we feel sick, it's not just our bodies that hurt. Sometimes other things can make us feel unwell, too. Can you tell me if something else is bothering you? The girl's eyes filled with tears as she looked up at the doctor. I don't want to talk about it, she whispered, clutching her stuffed rabbit tightly to her chest. But there was something in her voice that made Dr. Martinez pause. The pain in Lily's voice was unmistakable. This wasn't just the response of a scared child who didn't want to talk about being sick. This was a response from a child who had experienced something far worse than physical pain. And that realization was the turning point. The doctor knew that she was no longer just dealing with a medical case. She was dealing with a child who had been exposed to trauma on a scale she couldn't yet comprehend. Dr. Martinez's mind raced as she thought through her options. She couldn't ignore what she was seeing. The pieces were starting to fall into place. The child's silence, her fear, the bruises, the lack of a proper medical history. All of it pointed toward abuse, possibly even trafficking. But this wasn't something she could investigate alone. The weight of the situation was too much for one person to carry. Dr. Martinez knew she needed help. She made the decision to involve the authorities, but she also knew that this case would require more than just a typical investigation. It would need a full-scale intervention. Before she could act, Dr. Martinez noticed one last, key detail: a small, almost inconspicuous item that was tucked under Lily's shirt, just below the collar. It was a note, folded neatly, and it looked out of place. Dr. Martinez's hands trembled slightly as she reached for it. Unfolding it carefully, she read the few hastily scribbled words on the paper. "Help me. They won't let me go." The message was short, simple, and heartbreaking. It was everything Dr. Martinez needed to confirm her worst fears. This was no ordinary case of illness. This was a child who had been caught in a system of abuse, one that had been carefully hidden from view. Dr. Martinez's heart sank as she understood the gravity of the situation. Lily was not just in pain, she was trapped in a nightmare, and it was up to Dr. Martinez to help her break free. This discovery, though devastating, was the first step toward saving Lily. It was the moment the investigation shifted from being about physical symptoms to being about survival for Lily and for any other children who might be caught in the same system. Dr. Martinez knew the road ahead would be difficult, but she was no longer unsure. The truth had surfaced, and now there was no turning back. Lily's story was about to unfold, and Dr. Martinez was determined to see it through, no matter what it took. As Dr. Martinez carefully continued her examination of Lily, her concern deepened. The child's physical symptoms, initially thought to be isolated to a stomach ache, had quickly begun to reveal themselves as part of a larger, far more disturbing issue. Though Lily's pain was real, it was becoming increasingly clear that it wasn't merely a result of a medical condition. There were underlying emotional and psychological factors that were manifesting in her body. Despite the doctor's attempts to probe, Lily remained hesitant and fearful, unwilling to open up about her condition. However, Dr. Martinez had learned over the years to trust her instincts, and the subtle signs she was witnessing began to paint a picture of something far more sinister. The child's fear was palpable, and it was becoming evident that she was not simply afraid of the hospital or the medical procedures. There was something about her situation that made her afraid of talking, a hesitation that seemed to run deeper than the pain she was feeling. Dr. Martinez, having worked with children for years, was aware that children often had trouble articulating their emotions, especially when they had been exposed to trauma. But Lily's responses, her avoidance of eye contact, the trembling when asked certain questions, and the subtle signs of anxiety pointed to something more profound. It was not just fear of the unknown. It was fear of something or someone that Lily was unwilling or unable to confront directly. The doctor began to notice a recurring theme in Lily's answers. When asked about her symptoms, the child would offer vague, almost rehearsed responses. "It hurts here," Lily would say, pressing her small hand against her stomach, but she would avoid giving any further details. It was as if she was trying to minimize her discomfort, as if she were conditioned to downplay her own pain. When asked about the pain's duration or intensity, her answers were equally nonspecific, and each time she responded, Her eyes would dart toward the man in the corner who claimed to be her uncle. His presence seemed to act as a barrier between Lily and the truth. Every time Dr. Martinez asked a question, the child's reaction was to seek reassurance from him, almost as if she needed his approval before she could speak. It wasn't just Lily's behavior that was raising red flags. There were subtle signs that indicated a pattern of manipulation. The doctor's experience with children who had suffered from abuse or neglect led her to recognize these behaviors. Lily's refusal to speak openly, her fear of authority figures, and her need for constant reassurance were all indicative of a child who had been taught to suppress her emotions and withhold information. It was as if she had learned to protect herself by staying silent and obedient, a coping mechanism developed over time in response to an environment that had likely been abusive or neglectful. The child's fear of the man, who claimed to be her uncle, was particularly telling. It wasn't just a typical fear of a new or unfamiliar adult. There was a deeper, more profound terror in her eyes whenever she looked at him, as if she feared what might happen if she said the wrong thing. The more Dr. Martinez observed Lily's interactions with the man, the more her suspicions grew. The man's nervous behavior, his unwillingness to engage in the conversation, and his attempts to avoid answering questions were all signs that he was hiding something. When asked about the child's medical history, he was evasive and vague, offering little more than basic details that seemed rehearsed. He claimed that he was her uncle, but there was no evidence to support his story. Dr. Martinez noted that there were no legal documents or guardianship papers that confirmed his claim. In fact, there was no official record of Lily's guardianship at all. This was an immediate concern. In a case like this, where a child was in such a vulnerable position, there should have been legal documentation, social workers involved, and a clear history of the child's care. But the absence of these elements only added to the sense that something was seriously wrong. As the doctor reviewed Lily's medical records, the pattern of irregularities grew even clearer. There were no consistent follow-ups, no detailed notes from previous doctors, and most troubling of all, there were large gaps in her care history. Lily had been seen by various healthcare providers in the past, but none of them had bothered to document the child's ongoing medical issues. It was almost as if Lily had been deliberately moved between different providers, with each one failing to notice the bigger picture. This lack of continuity in her care was a glaring red flag. It suggested that the people involved in her life were actively avoiding proper medical oversight, potentially to cover up the extent of her condition or to keep her from being scrutinized by those who could uncover the truth. Dr. Martinez knew she had to dig deeper. She couldn't rely solely on her instincts. She needed hard evidence to support her growing suspicions. She began contacting local child protective services, running background checks on the man claiming to be Lily's uncle, and reviewing any records she could find about the child's recent foster placements. The more she learned, the more disturbing the case became. It seemed that Lily had been in and out of several homes in a short period of time, each one less stable than the last. None of the homes were permanent, and there was no indication that Lily had ever had a chance to settle down in one place. Each time she moved, the circumstances surrounding her departure were vague, with little explanation for why she was sent away or who had made the decision. It was clear that Lily had never had a stable home, and her constant relocation seemed to be part of a pattern of manipulation and control. Dr. Martinez's growing sense of unease was confirmed when she received the results of the background check on Mike Patterson. There were no official records linking him to Lily's family, and his name did not appear in any legal guardianship documents. Worse still, his background was filled with inconsistencies. Mike Patterson had been involved in a few minor incidents in the past, but there were no criminal charges. However, Dr. Martinez couldn't shake the feeling that his history was part of a larger, more insidious story. The more she looked into his past, the more she began to question his role in Lily's life. He was not her relative as he had claimed. He had no legal right to care for her, and there was no evidence that he was acting in her best interest. His actions, his reluctance to provide any real details, and his evasive behavior all pointed toward one unsettling conclusion. Mike Patterson was part of a larger, more dangerous operation, and Lily was at the center of it. With each new piece of information, the case began to take shape. Dr. Martinez started to see a pattern of child trafficking and exploitation. Lily wasn't just a victim of neglect or abuse, she was a pawn in a much bigger game. The lack of proper documentation, the frequent moves between foster homes, the absence of a stable guardian, all of these elements fit the profile of a child being trafficked for some form of exploitation. Dr. Martinez knew that she couldn't let this go any further. She had to act quickly to protect Lily and uncover the full scope of what was happening. The more Dr. Martinez uncovered, the more the gravity of the situation became apparent. This was not just a case of child neglect or abuse, it was a case of organized child trafficking, one that had been carefully hidden behind layers of bureaucracy and manipulation. The people involved were skilled at covering their tracks, and they had used every loophole in the system to exploit children like Lily for their own gain. But now, with the pieces falling into place, Dr. Martinez knew she was close to exposing the full extent of the operation. She was determined to ensure that Lily would be the last child to suffer in this way, and she would stop at nothing to bring those responsible to justice. Dr. Martinez sat in her office, her hands shaking slightly as she ran through the details in her mind. Lily's condition, her behavior, and the unsettling discoveries she had uncovered all pointed to one grim conclusion. This was no ordinary medical emergency. It was clear that Lily wasn't just suffering from physical pain. She was trapped in a situation far more dangerous and far more complicated than anyone could have imagined. Dr. Martinez's instincts had been honed over the years, and now they screamed that she had to act. But what was unfolding before her wasn't just a matter of medical treatment, it was a potential criminal investigation. As the gravity of the situation settled in, Dr. Martinez knew that this was bigger than her, bigger than the hospital, and it was bigger than just the child in front of her. Her professional training had prepared her for many things, but not for this, a case where the health and safety of a child were intertwined with a far-reaching criminal enterprise. And in that moment, Dr. Martinez made a decision that would change everything. She needed to call for help, not just for medical assistance, but for law enforcement, because this wasn't just about Lily's pain, it was about stopping a system of exploitation that was hiding in plain sight. Her hands hovered over the phone, her mind racing as she dialed the emergency number. As the phone rang, a wave of emotion washed over her, mixing with the urgency she felt. She had seen a lot in her career, but nothing like this. Her training had never prepared her for the depth of despair that came with realizing that the child in front of her was not just sick, she was a victim of something much worse. Something that required immediate intervention. When the 911 operator answered, Dr. Martinez's voice wavered for a brief moment, the weight of the situation threatening to overwhelm her. "This is Dr. Sophia Martinez." She began, her voice steady despite the emotions bubbling just beneath the surface. "I need to report a potential child abuse case. There's an 8-year-old girl in my care, and I believe she's being trafficked. I'm not sure how, but the signs are there." The words felt heavy as they left her mouth. She had spent years working in pediatrics, diagnosing and treating children with everything from simple colds to life-threatening conditions, but she had never encountered something like this. Her mind flashed back to Lily's terrified eyes, the bruises she had noticed, the fear that had emanated from the child every time she looked at the man who claimed to be her guardian. There was something about the situation that had seemed wrong from the start, but now it was all falling into place. This wasn't a simple case of illness, it was a child in need of protection from something far worse. The operator, sensing the urgency in Dr. Martinez's voice, responded immediately. "Dr. Martinez, I'm sending help right now. Can you provide any details about the child's condition or the person who brought her in?" Dr. Martinez took a deep breath and began to recount what she had discovered. She explained that Lily had been in and out of foster homes, had no legal guardian, and that the man who brought her in had no official documentation. Her description of the child's physical condition, stomach pain, bruising, and the lack of proper medical documentation only reinforced the gravity of the situation. The doctor explained how the child had seemed emotionally withdrawn, how she was fearful of speaking up, and how the man had been evasive when asked about Lily's background. I've done a thorough examination. Dr. Martinez continued, her voice resolute. I don't believe her pain is physical, it's emotional and psychological. She's been through something. I don't know what, but it's clear that her pain is coming from a place of trauma, not just a medical condition. The operator's voice grew more serious as the details came in. We're dispatching a unit to your location immediately, Dr. Martinez. We'll need to get full details on the man who brought her in and check his background. Do you have any idea of where he might have taken her from? Dr. Martinez hesitated for a moment, her mind spinning as she tried to piece together the fragments of information. She mentioned a few names, people she stayed with before. I don't know who they are, but they might be important. The doctor recounted what little she had been able to gather about the child's past, names, places, and any other details that might help law enforcement piece together the story. As she spoke, Dr. Martinez could hear the urgency in the operator's voice. She could feel the gravity of the situation growing heavier with every word. She had known something was wrong from the moment Lily had walked into the examination room, but now, as the reality of the situation sank in, Dr. Martinez realized just how serious this was. Lily's suffering wasn't just medical, it was part of something larger, something that could only be stopped by the intervention of the authorities. The operator assured Dr. Martinez that a team would be arriving soon, but they needed to keep Lily in a safe, controlled environment until they could conduct a proper investigation. Can you ensure that the man stays in the room with you while we get here? We need to make sure no one leaves the area, the operator instructed. We'll need statements from both you and the child as soon as we arrive. Dr. Martinez nodded, even though the operator couldn't see her. Yes, I'll make sure they stay here. Please hurry. I'm not sure how much time we have. She felt a rush of emotion flood through her as she realized that in this moment, her role was no longer just as a doctor. She was now a witness to something much bigger than a medical case. She was the first line of defense for a child who was trapped in a situation she couldn't escape on her own. Dr. Martinez could feel the weight of the responsibility on her shoulders as she realized that the steps she took now would determine the safety and future of Lily and possibly other children who were caught in the same web. As the call continued, the operator assured Dr. Martinez that law enforcement was already en route and a child services team was being contacted to handle the case. They reassured her that they would take over once they arrived, but Dr. Martinez couldn't shake the feeling of urgency in her chest. She needed to protect this child, to ensure that Lily didn't slip through the cracks of a system that was already failing her. The more she thought about it, the more she understood that this was just the beginning. The system was broken, and Lily's case was a symptom of that larger issue. But right now, her focus had to be on getting the girl the help she needed, on making sure she wasn't sent back into the hands of those who had already harmed her. Dr. Martinez could feel the tears welling in her eyes as she continued to speak with the operator. She didn't allow herself to cry. She couldn't, not yet. But her heart ached for Lily, for the countless other children who were likely in the same position. The world had failed them. But Dr. Martinez wasn't going to let that happen to this little girl. She would do whatever it took to make sure Lily's story wasn't just another one lost in the system. When the call ended, Dr. Martinez sat back in her chair for a moment, trying to collect her thoughts. Her hands were still trembling, her mind racing. She had made the call, and now all she could do was wait. But even as she waited, a sense of determination began to rise in her. She had seen a lot in her career, but this case felt different. It felt personal. She wasn't just a doctor, she was a protector. And Lily, this innocent child, needed her more than ever. As the minutes passed, Dr. Martinez steeled herself for what was to come. She would not let this moment slip away. She would stand by Lily, stand by every child who had been failed by the system, and fight for the truth to be heard. And when law enforcement arrived, they would face not just a medical case, but a story of survival of abuse and of a child who had been brave enough to seek help, even when she had no idea who could be trusted. As the moments passed, Dr. Martinez sat in her office, her mind running through every detail of Lily's case. She had made the 911 call in a desperate attempt to ensure the safety of the child, but now, with the arrival of law enforcement imminent, the weight of what lay ahead settled heavily on her shoulders. She had done what she could, gathered the facts, made her observations, and kept Lily as safe as possible in the meantime. But now the responsibility had shifted. She knew that once the police arrived, the investigation would take on a life of its own. The power to intervene would no longer be in her hands alone. But even with the law enforcement team arriving, Dr. Martinez couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that what they were about to uncover would change everything, not just for Lily, but for a system that had failed this child time and time again. The arrival of law enforcement brought an immediate shift in the atmosphere at the hospital. There was no more room for uncertainty. Now, things had to be handled with careful precision. Officers entered the building with authority, their presence filling the room as they assessed the situation. Dr. Martinez, though still emotionally overwhelmed, knew she had to remain calm, clear-headed, and cooperative. As the officers came to her, she briefed them on everything she had discovered. Lily's pain, the bruises she had observed, her reluctance to speak, and most importantly, the lack of legal guardianship paperwork for the man claiming to be her uncle. She outlined Lily's medical history, pointing out the inconsistencies and gaps in her care. It was clear from the start that this wasn't a typical child abuse case. The more she spoke, the more Dr. Martinez realized that this was not just about one child in pain, it was about a system failing children like Lily, children who had been moved from home to home with no one to watch over them. As the police officers took note of her statement, the tension in the room was palpable. Dr. Martinez could sense the shift from a medical issue to a criminal investigation, and with it came a feeling of unease that lingered in the air. This wasn't just a question of what had happened to Lily, it was now a question of how deep this issue went. The officers began their questioning of the man who had brought Lily in, a man who continued to insist that he was her temporary guardian. His story remained unchanged, and yet there was something about his demeanor that raised more questions than answers. He was visibly nervous, shifting his weight from foot to foot, and avoided making eye contact with the officers when they asked direct questions. His answers were vague, inconsistent, and seemed rehearsed, but the officers knew better than to let him off the hook. The more they pressed him for details about Lily's family and her previous foster care arrangements, the more his story began to unravel. He could provide no documentation or concrete information about his relationship to the girl. When asked about the last time he had seen her parents, he hesitated, his response lacking the natural flow of someone telling the truth. At first, he claimed he had been the one to take Lily in after her parents had to go away, but his explanation seemed hollow. When the officers requested to see the legal paperwork regarding Lily's guardianship, the man became increasingly agitated, a clear sign that his story was beginning to crumble. It was becoming evident that his role in Lily's life was not as straightforward as he had made it seem. Dr. Martinez observed the unfolding situation with a mixture of anxiety and relief. She knew that this was just the beginning of a much larger investigation, one that could uncover systemic failures, abuse, and potentially even criminal trafficking. She had feared for Lily's safety since the moment she had entered the room, and now, as the officers worked to piece together the truth, Dr. Martinez began to realize that the situation was far more complex than anyone had anticipated. The tension in the room intensified when the officers began asking the man for identification. He stammered, struggling to find his documents, and when he finally produced a set of papers, they were incomplete and inconsistent with what one would expect from a legal guardian. His reluctance to share more detailed information, coupled with his defensiveness, raised further suspicions. It wasn't just the lack of official guardianship papers that troubled the officers, it was the man's behavior. He was too eager to avoid direct questions and seemed to be hiding something. His insistence that the matter was not serious only made him appear more suspicious. At this point, the investigation began to turn in a new direction. The officers began to look at the situation from a broader perspective. It wasn't just Lily who was in danger. It was possible that other children were caught up in a similar situation, moved from home to home without the proper care or oversight. As the man continued to deflect their questions, the officers began to suspect that Lily's case was not an isolated incident. There was something deeply wrong with the way she had been moved from one place to another, each transition marked by vague explanations and a lack of proper documentation. The officers began asking about the other people who had been involved in Lily's care, but the man remained tight-lipped, refusing to provide anything of value. The more the police dug, the more the situation began to resemble a pattern, one that was larger and more dangerous than anyone had imagined. This was not just a case of a neglected child. Dr. Martinez began to realize that Lily was part of something much bigger, something that involved multiple children, multiple homes, and perhaps an organized effort to exploit children for some hidden purpose. The way the man acted, the lack of legal oversight, and the unwillingness to provide concrete answers all pointed to something deeply disturbing, something that could not be ignored. As the investigation continued, the officers turned their attention to the man's phone. When they asked him to hand it over, he hesitated again, his fingers trembling as he passed the device over. The officers immediately began looking through the phone's call records and messages, but it was clear that they were not getting the full picture. The man's phone contained few useful details, but the officers knew they needed to dig deeper. At this point, the investigation was no longer about Lily's immediate medical needs. It was about uncovering a larger criminal operation. The most shocking revelation came when the officers began cross-referencing Lily's case with others in the system. They pulled up records of other children who had been in similar situations, children who had moved through multiple foster homes with little explanation, and whose medical histories were incomplete or doctored. The officers quickly realized that Lily was not the only child who had been lost in the system. There were others, children whose names appeared in various records, but whose whereabouts had never been tracked. The magnitude of what they were dealing with began to sink in, and the investigation shifted gears. What they were uncovering was no longer just about one child's abuse. It was about a network of neglect and exploitation that had been hidden within the very system that was supposed to protect children. The discovery that Lily was not an isolated case was both alarming and relieving. It meant that the authorities had the chance to stop a much larger problem before more children were affected. But it also meant that the scope of the problem was more vast and complex than anyone had realized. The officers understood that they had to act quickly and decisively. The longer the perpetrators operated in the shadows, the more children would fall through the cracks of the system. As the investigation unfolded, it became increasingly clear that the case was far from over. This wasn't just about finding Lily's abuser, it was about dismantling an entire system of exploitation that had existed undetected for far too long. Dr. Martinez, though deeply disturbed by the revelations, felt a sense of purpose and resolve settle within her. She had seen firsthand the suffering of a child who had been caught in a broken system, but now she was part of something bigger. The fight to protect every child who had been forgotten or ignored by the very system designed to keep them safe. As the police continued their work, Dr. Martinez remained by Lily's side, her commitment to uncovering the truth stronger than ever. The investigation had only just begun, but Dr. Martinez knew that this case would change everything. For Lily, for the system, and for every child who deserved a chance at a better life. As the investigation continued, law enforcement began to dig deeper into Lily's background. What had seemed like a straightforward medical case was quickly revealing itself to be something much more sinister. With the information gathered so far, it was clear that Lily's condition wasn't just the result of a temporary illness or neglect. It was part of a much larger pattern that had been carefully concealed. The lack of proper guardianship documentation, the inconsistencies in the man's story, and the gaps in Lily's medical history all pointed to a deliberate effort to keep the truth hidden. Dr. Martinez's initial suspicions were beginning to take shape. This was not an isolated incident. There was something systemic at play, something far more complex than anyone had initially realized. Law enforcement started by questioning everyone involved in Lily's care. The man who had brought her into the hospital, claiming to be her temporary guardian, was the first person under scrutiny. His story seemed too rehearsed, his answers too vague. As the officers delved into his background, they discovered that his relationship with Lily was fabricated. There were no official records or legal paperwork linking him to the child, and his name didn't appear in any guardianship filings or foster care systems. His claims of being Lily's uncle were unsubstantiated, and with each question, the cracks in his story grew wider. The man's evasiveness, combined with his nervous behavior, made it clear that he was hiding something. As the officers continued to press him for details, his anxiety only increased, and it became apparent that he wasn't merely a confused relative, he was a participant in something far darker. The more law enforcement uncovered, the more disturbing the case became. They learned that Lily had been moved between multiple foster homes in a short period, each time under suspicious circumstances. None of the homes seemed to provide long-term stability, and there were few official records to track her whereabouts. The foster families, if they could even be called that, were all linked by a common thread of secrecy. Each household seemed to be a temporary stop in Lily's journey, with no one truly invested in her well-being. There were no permanent caregivers, no real efforts to ensure her safety or development. The social services system, which was supposed to protect children like Lily, had failed her at every turn. The lack of oversight, the absence of legal guardianship, and the incomplete medical records all suggested that someone had been pulling the strings from behind the scenes. As the investigation continued to unfold, the true nature of Lily's situation became clearer. Law enforcement began to piece together the web of lies and manipulation that had kept the child in a cycle of instability. It was as if Lily's very existence had been manipulated, her life orchestrated by people who had no real interest in her safety or well-being. The more officers dug into her background, the more they realized that this wasn't an isolated case. Lily's story was not unique. There were other children who had been moved in and out of the system in similar ways, each one a pawn in a larger operation. The lack of proper documentation, the hasty transfers from one foster home to another, and the evasive behavior of the so-called guardians all pointed toward a much bigger problem: a system of child trafficking that had been operating right under the authorities' noses. The officers began to make connections between Lily's case and others like hers. They discovered that children from vulnerable families, children in temporary care, or those with uncertain guardianship, were being systematically moved from home to home. These children, like Lily, were never given the chance to settle in one place or receive consistent care. They were shuffled around in a way that made it impossible for anyone to track them, and no one ever seemed to question the strange arrangements. As the officers followed the leads, they began to uncover a disturbing pattern of child exploitation. Children were being placed in homes where their presence was never properly documented, and they were being moved from one family to another without any real oversight. It was clear that this was no accident. This was a well-organized system designed to take advantage of children who were already at risk. With each new discovery, the mystery deepened. Law enforcement began to suspect that the individuals involved in these schemes were connected to a larger criminal network, one that was operating in plain sight within the foster care system. These criminals had found a way to exploit a vulnerable population and use it for their own gain. The children, like Lily, were simply commodities to be moved around, exploited, and discarded. But what was even more troubling was that these individuals had found ways to work within the system using loopholes and manipulation to avoid detection. The authorities were faced with a difficult reality. A system that was supposed to protect children was being used as a tool for exploitation, and it was happening right under their noses. The deeper the investigation went, the more law enforcement uncovered about the network behind the trafficking operation. The man who had brought Lily into the hospital, though seemingly unimportant at first, was just a small cog in a much larger machine. As officers began to trace his connections, they found that he was linked to a network of people involved in child trafficking. These individuals were operating in various parts of the state, moving children through a series of foster homes and temporary guardianships, all while avoiding the scrutiny of the authorities. The network appeared to be well coordinated, with individuals working together to ensure that the children they moved were never fully integrated into society, never given the opportunity to grow in stable, supportive environments. They were nothing more than pawns, moved around at the whim of people who saw them as little more than a means to an end. As the investigation continued, Dr. Martinez began to understand the full scope of what was happening. She had suspected from the beginning that Lily's case was not isolated, but the extent of the operation was more than she had ever imagined. The hospital, which had once been a place of healing, was now at the center of a criminal investigation that threatened to expose a vast network of child trafficking. Dr. Martinez found herself grappling with the enormity of the situation. She had always believed in the medical system, in the idea that it was a place of safety and care, but now she realized that it was also a place where children like Lily had been abused and exploited. This was no longer just a medical case, it was a fight for justice for children who had been silenced and forgotten by a system that was supposed to protect them. The truth behind Lily's condition grew more complex as the investigation continued. What had initially seemed like a case of neglect and abuse was now clearly linked to a criminal network that was trafficking children for profit. The more law enforcement uncovered, the more it became clear that this wasn't a random event, it was part of an organized system that had been in place for years. Lily had become the face of a much larger issue, one that demanded immediate attention and action. As the investigation moved forward, Dr. Martinez remained determined to help uncover the full extent of the operation. She knew that there were more children like Lily out there, children who were being moved from home to home, children who were being exploited by those who claimed to care for them. The more she learned, the more she realized how broken the system was and how much work needed to be done to fix it. But with each new discovery, Dr. Martinez also felt a sense of hope. They were getting closer to the truth, and with each step, they were one step closer to ensuring that children like Lily would never have to suffer in silence again. In the weeks that followed, law enforcement would continue to unravel the mystery, slowly dismantling the criminal network that had been operating within the foster care system. The truth about what had happened to Lily and what had happened to countless other children would eventually come to light. But for now, Dr. Martinez had the satisfaction of knowing that the first pieces of the puzzle had been uncovered and that Lily, though scarred, would have a chance at a new beginning. After weeks of investigation, Dr. Martinez, law enforcement, and Child Protective Services had pieced together enough evidence to confront Mike Patterson, the man who had claimed to be Lily's guardian. With each piece of information gathered, his story seemed to fall apart further. The more they dug into his background, the more inconsistencies arose. His reluctance to provide concrete details, his lack of documentation regarding his guardianship of Lily, and the inconsistencies in his statements made it clear that he was hiding something. At first, he had appeared to be a confused, well-meaning relative, but as the investigation progressed, it became apparent that he was far from the protective figure he had portrayed himself to be. In fact, Mike Patterson was a central player in a much larger, darker story, one that involved the exploitation and trafficking of vulnerable children, including Lily. Dr. Martinez had always suspected that the situation surrounding Lily was more complex than a simple case of neglect. She had seen the signs, the bruises, the withdrawn behavior, the fear in Lily's eyes when she looked at the man who claimed to care for her. It was clear to her from the beginning that Lily's physical pain was merely a symptom of a much deeper trauma, one that she couldn't express. But the true nature of that trauma was only beginning to come to light. What they had uncovered so far pointed to a network of criminals using the foster care system to exploit children for purposes that were as horrifying as they were insidious. Now, with enough evidence in hand, it was time for the confrontation. Mike Patterson was about to be confronted with the truth, and he would have to face the consequences of his actions. Dr. Martinez knew that this moment could be critical, not just for Lily's case, but for every other child caught up in the same system of abuse. This was a pivotal moment in the investigation, one that could expose the full extent of the criminal network operating behind the scenes. The officers took the lead in the confrontation, but Dr. Martinez stood by, ready to provide any medical insight that might be necessary. It was clear that they had to be careful with how they approached Mike Patterson. The evidence was stacked against him, but he was still in a position to lie, to obfuscate, and to make excuses. Dr. Martinez had seen it before. Perpetrators who denied the truth, even when it was staring them in the face, who tried to manipulate the system to avoid taking responsibility for their actions. She couldn't let that happen here, not with Lily's future hanging in the balance. The first part of the confrontation was straightforward. The officers asked Patterson to account for his involvement in Lily's life, pressing him on the details of how and why he had taken her in. His answers were vague, and as the questions became more pointed, he began to show signs of nervousness. He claimed that Lily's parents had been unfit to care for her and that he had stepped in to provide a temporary solution. But when pressed further, his story started to unravel. There was no documentation, no legal custody papers, no record of any official arrangement with child services. His story didn't match the facts, and it became increasingly clear that he was fabricating parts of it. Dr. Martinez listened carefully, watching Mike Patterson's every reaction. His fidgeting, his avoidance of eye contact, his stammering answers, these were all signs of guilt. The man who had been so insistent on his role as Lily's guardian was now retreating into defensiveness and denial. Dr. Martinez had seen it before with patients who were hiding the truth from their doctors. Denial was often a defense mechanism, a way to protect oneself from facing the reality of what had happened. But this was different. Patterson wasn't just denying a medical condition, he was denying responsibility for the harm he had caused. As the questioning continued, the officers became more aggressive, pressing him for specific details. At first, Patterson resisted, but as the evidence mounted, his facade began to crumble. The officers presented him with the evidence they had gathered, the lack of legal documentation, the inconsistencies in his story, and the medical evidence that pointed to neglect and abuse. He hesitated for a moment, but then, in a moment of sheer panic, he admitted something that shocked everyone in the room. "I never meant for it to go this far," Patterson said, his voice shaking. "I didn't mean for her to get hurt. I didn't know who else to turn to. She wasn't supposed to stay with me for long. I just needed her to be quiet, to stay out of the way, until I could figure things out. But it all spiraled out of control. I didn't know who to trust." The confession, though fragmented and incomplete, was enough to reveal the truth. Patterson had been part of a much larger scheme, one that involved moving children from home to home, all while keeping them in a state of fear and dependence. His role in this operation had been to provide temporary guardianship for children, but in reality he had been a cog in a machine that used vulnerable children for exploitation. He had been complicit in a system that had deprived children like Lily of their safety, their stability, and their futures. At that moment, everything changed. Dr. Martinez could feel the weight of the truth settling over the room. Patterson's confession didn't just clear up Lily's situation. It opened the door to a much larger investigation. There was more to this than just one man and one child. This was about a network of criminals working within the foster care system, using their positions to exploit children for profit. Dr. Martinez realized that this was only the beginning. What they had uncovered in this room was just a small piece of a much larger puzzle. Patterson's confession triggered a shift in the investigation. The officers began to look more closely at the other people involved in the operation. They expanded their focus beyond Patterson and started to investigate the other individuals he had been in contact with, those who had placed children in his care, those who had moved them between homes, and those who had used the foster care system as a cover for their criminal activities. The investigation was growing, and what had started as a medical emergency had now evolved into a full-scale operation to uncover a trafficking ring that had been operating under the radar for years. For Dr. Martinez, the confrontation with Patterson was both a relief and a burden. The truth was finally out, but the magnitude of what had been uncovered was overwhelming. She had suspected that Lily's case was part of something larger, but the reality of the situation was even worse than she had imagined. The corruption in the system ran deep, and the children who had been moved through it were victims, not just of neglect, but of a vast criminal operation that had used them as commodities. As the officers took Patterson into custody, Dr. Martinez felt a mix of emotions. She was relieved that the truth was finally being exposed, but she also felt an overwhelming sense of sadness for Lily and the other children who had been caught in the system. The damage had already been done, but there was still work to be done to ensure that no other child would have to endure what Lily had gone through. This confrontation had been a critical moment in the investigation, but it was far from the end. The real work was just beginning. Dr. Martinez knew that the investigation would continue to unfold over the coming weeks and that there would be many more difficult moments ahead. But for now, she found solace in one simple truth: Lily was safe. The child who had walked into the hospital in pain, frightened, and alone was now one step closer to a future free from fear and exploitation. And though the road ahead would be long and filled with challenges, Dr. Martinez was more determined than ever to make sure that Lily's story would not be forgotten. The fight to protect children like her was just beginning. With the truth now fully revealed, the heavy burden that had weighed on Dr. Martinez and the entire team slowly began to lift. But it wasn't the relief of victory that filled the air, it was the sobering reality of the damage that had already been done. The perpetrators had been apprehended, but there was still much to process. The investigations had led to arrests, but each arrest came with the harsh recognition of how deep the corruption had run. The law enforcement officers who had worked tirelessly to unravel the network of trafficking and exploitation were left with the bittersweet realization that justice had been served, but it came at the cost of so many lives being ruined in the process. The children who had been moved through the system like pawns, their future stolen, would never fully recover from the trauma they had experienced. Yet, for Lily, the long road to healing had just begun. Her emotional recovery was a slow process, and though her physical wounds had been treated, the scars left by the abuse and neglect ran much deeper. Lily had spent years living in fear, moving from one home to another without ever truly feeling safe. She had learned to hide her pain, to suppress her emotions, because that was what she thought she had to do in order to survive. Now, in the aftermath of the arrest, she was confronted with the reality that everything she had known, everything she had been told, had been a lie. Her world had been shattered, and in the wake of that devastation, she was forced to rebuild. Dr. Martinez kept in touch with Lily's progress after the arrest, closely monitoring her emotional state and providing as much support as possible. Though Lily had been placed in the care of a more stable foster home, it wasn't enough to erase the fear that still gripped her. She would often wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, her body shaking with anxiety. The trauma had left her with a constant sense of unease, as though she could never fully relax, never fully trust anyone again. It was the emotional aftermath of everything she had endured. She had been betrayed by the very system that was supposed to protect her, and now she had to find a way to heal from the wounds it had inflicted. For Dr. Martinez, the emotional recovery of the children she treated was always just as important as their physical well-being, if not more so. She had spent years studying child development and trauma, and she knew that the scars left by abuse could be just as debilitating as any physical injury. She spent hours speaking with Lily, gently encouraging her to open up about her feelings, about the things she had experienced, and slowly, Lily began to trust her. The road was long, but it was a start. She would never be the same child she was before the abuse, but with time, patience, and the support of those around her, Lily began to find her voice. She began to understand that she wasn't to blame for what had happened to her, and that she had the right to heal, to feel safe, and to hope again. As Lily began her healing process, Dr. Martinez also found herself reflecting on the importance of standing up for children like Lily, children who had been failed by a system that was supposed to protect them. She had always been passionate about her work, but the events surrounding Lily's case had shifted her perspective in ways she hadn't expected. Dr. Martinez realized that the work she did as a pediatrician went far beyond just diagnosing and treating physical ailments. It was about advocating for the well-being of children, about being a voice for those who couldn't speak for themselves, and about challenging a broken system that allowed children to slip through the cracks. The case had shown her how fragile the safety nets were for vulnerable children and how easily they could be exploited when no one was looking. The arrest of the perpetrators, while a step toward justice, was not the end of the work that needed to be done. Dr. Martinez began to work with advocacy groups, law enforcement, and policymakers to push for changes in the foster care system. She wanted to make sure that no other child had to endure the same trauma that Lily had. The system needed reform, and Dr. Martinez became a vocal advocate for those reforms. She used her position as a respected medical professional to raise awareness about the flaws in the system and to push for stricter regulations and better oversight. She worked with social workers and child protection organizations to ensure that every child who entered the system would be given the proper care and attention they deserved. The emotional toll that the case had taken on Dr. Martinez was not easily shaken. She had always been committed to her patients, but Lily's case had left a mark on her that she couldn't ignore. The sadness she felt for the children who had suffered under the care of those who were supposed to protect them was overwhelming, and the guilt she felt for not seeing the signs sooner was something she struggled with daily. But as the months passed, Dr. Martinez began to find solace in the progress that Lily made. She saw the small victories, Lily speaking more openly, learning to trust again, and slowly starting to smile again. Every day, she took a step toward reclaiming her life. For Dr. Martinez, these moments were a reminder of why she had become a pediatrician in the first place, to make a difference in the lives of children, to be a source of healing in their darkest moments. In the weeks following the arrest, the emotional recovery of the other children who had been involved in the trafficking operation became a focal point for the team of social workers and therapists assigned to their cases. They worked tirelessly to ensure that these children, like Lily, received the support they needed to heal. The work was grueling and the cases were heartbreaking, but there was a sense of purpose that drove everyone involved. The children, many of whom had been separated from their families for years, were given the chance to rebuild their lives. They were given the opportunity to heal, to learn to trust again, and to find safety in a world that had once failed them. The legal proceedings against the perpetrators continued, and while justice was being served, the true cost of the operation became increasingly apparent. Dozens of children, like Lily, had been victims of a system that had allowed them to be trafficked, abused, and neglected. The legal system, though slow-moving, began to bring the perpetrators to justice. Mike Patterson and others involved in the trafficking ring were arrested and charged, and as the trial progressed, the full extent of their actions was revealed. The sense of justice that came with their conviction was tempered by the knowledge that for every child rescued, there were others still out there, lost in a system that had failed them. As the case came to a close, Lily was finally able to return to a stable, loving home with her new foster family, a family who was committed to helping her heal. Though it would take time, and the scars of her past would always be a part of her, Lily began to feel a sense of safety that she had never known before. She was no longer a pawn in a criminal operation. She was a child again, with the chance to grow, to learn, and to live a life free from fear. Dr. Martinez visited Lily occasionally, and each time she saw the progress the little girl was making. She was learning to laugh again, to play again, to feel the joy that every child should have the right to experience. Lily's emotional recovery was still a long process, but she had started on the path to healing. For Dr. Martinez, this was the ultimate reward. It wasn't the arrests or the legal victories that mattered most. It was the knowledge that Lily and the other children involved in the case would have a chance at a better life. The aftermath of the case was a mixture of relief, sadness, and resolve. The justice that had been served was important, but it was only one part of a much larger story. Dr. Martinez knew that there was still work to be done, that the system still needed to be reformed, and that there would always be more children like Lily who needed protection. But she also knew that with every case, with every victory, they were making a difference. The fight for justice was never truly over, but with each step, they were getting closer to a future where children like Lily could grow up safe, loved, and protected from harm. As the case finally draws to a close, the sense of justice is bittersweet. While the criminals who had exploited children like Lily are now behind bars, the emotional scars that remain from the trauma are not so easily erased. Dr. Martinez reflects on the profound impact this case has had on her, how it has changed the way she views her work, the importance of standing up for the vulnerable, and the critical need for reform within systems meant to protect children. This case has shown her the dark undercurrents of child exploitation that so often go unnoticed, and the fight to protect these children is far from over. While justice has been served for Lily, the journey to healing is only beginning, and Dr. Martinez is committed to continuing her advocacy for those whose voices have been silenced. As this emotional journey comes to an end, we ask you to reflect on what you would do in Dr. Martinez's shoes. How would you respond if you were the first to uncover the truth? Don't forget to subscribe to HOA Denied Access for more emotional, gripping stories like this one. Share your thoughts below. Let's keep the conversation going and continue to raise awareness for those who need it most.